yeah, kind of an anticlimax in some ways, partly because of Grant's strategy. He's just going to keep grinding away. He's going to keep throwing troops at Lee, and Lee just doesn't have any reinforcements coming. So these two massive armies eventually, it's just sort of one larger mass against a smaller mass, and the larger mass wins. That's, kind of ends with a whimper, I guess you could say. Lincoln's assassination, which we haven't gotten to in class, which I would definitely like to, but you have probably touched on in your reading guides. We've got a quote that's very interesting. A historian saying, "His death could not have been better timed if he had hired an assassin," meaning really his legacy lives on super positively. I mean, a lot of people would say Lincoln was the best president America ever had, but a lot of that legacy is preserved because he dies almost at the perfect time. The war ends. He dies several days later, so he's had nothing to reduce his popularity, and he is remembered for all the good things and barely any of the potentially damaging things to his reputation. But realistically, the year before, he could have been voted out of office. Like, he was in serious danger. This person we're saying is sort of the greatest president ever. He was in danger of losing the election just the year previous. Partly because Northerners, a lot of them anyway, were dissatisfied with his approach. They wanted peace. They wanted an end to the seemingly endless war. And yes, definitely was a great tragedy, but don't want to underestimate that. Some conclusions that we can draw. There are so many long-term effects from the war. It's hard to even condense them in this space. But as we start to see right away, there's unanswered questions about how the former slaves are going to reintegrate into society, and or I should say not reintegrate like they're prisoners, but become their own families and political entities, and gain representation in Congress and that sort of thing. So these unanswered questions continue, and including a clip we didn't see, historian Barbara Fields says, well, who won the war? And she really responds, not so much just that the Union won, but that the war was inconclusive, was fundamentally inconclusive, that the status of freed slaves, even though there's all sorts of amendments about it, even though there's all sorts of new laws and militarily enforced freedom, it's not necessarily that everything changes, though. And after a relatively short period, black Americans in the South, at least, if not in the North as well, are pretty badly off again. In many cases, kept from voting by all sorts of so-called Jim Crow laws, things which remain problems for, believe it or not, well, apart from the problems which persist to this day, problems on paper, problems in political reality for another 100 years after the Civil War. And this couple sort of long-term effects we want to point to is that, as we've mentioned before, Sherman's march really debilitates the South's economy going forward, and the Union, because of the growth of industry during the war, comes out even more strong than ever before. So the sort of economic disparity that went into the causes of the war continues, but sort of redoubled, because the South has literally been destroyed to a large, in a lot of ways by Sherman, and just other other battles being fought on Southern soil, but the North's industrial strength is increased during the war. So that this almost guarantees the dominance of the North over the South in political matters going forward. The Civil War, as far as international perceptions go, we've got nations staying out. There's changes in the ideas about how a democracy ought to work. Now that we know that it can work, in a sense, the Civil War is the test of whether a democratic republic can exist, or whether factionalism or sectionalism is going to, destroy it eventually. And this was the test that other nations were waiting to see to a large extent. With Lincoln assassinated, his vice president, Andrew Johnson, becomes president. And he's from Tennessee, but he was a Democrat, which might sound surprising, but Lincoln was so desperate for more votes that he actually sort of had a double bill ticket with a Democrat, even though he was a Republican, to try to pull in as many votes as possible. And it works. He wins the election of 1864, but when he dies, we find out really that Andrew Johnson, even though he's from Tennessee, wants to punish the South a lot more than Lincoln would have. So that we have this really bitter process after the war of radical Republicans and folks like Johnson who really despised the sort of upper class planters in the South. They just get way more extreme than Lincoln was going to. Lincoln was going to let states back in if like 10% of the population signed an oath of allegiance. And all of a sudden, with Johnson, it's like 50%. And we're going to see, a lot of people pardoned and all this, and then Johnson's going nuts against the folks that he doesn't like in the South. And so he and radical Republicans really succeed, so to speak, in punishing the South. But kind of like Germany after World War I, these punishments don't help reconcile things and really just lead to more problems. The whole Reconstruction thing kind of falls apart within about 13, 14 years. Former slaves do not fully gain the rights that the Constitution, the constitutional amendments following the war were supposed to give them. So this embittering process is what we're going to be looking at as we're looking at Reconstruction, this era directly following the Civil War.